hijacked buildings have been in the spotlight since the deaths of over 70 people in the Johannesburg fire last week. In the city alone, at least 134 buildings were found to be illegally occupied out of 500 buildings audited. This morning, we're taking a look at how much revenue municipalities are losing through illegal water and electricity connections, which are common in these buildings. To help us answer some of our burning questions, we're joined by local government and revenue expert Miyelani Holeni, who is also the Group Chief Advisor at Ntiyiso Consulting Group. Thank you very much, Mr. Holeni, for your time here on eNCA. And I was saying to you off air that the more we talk about these situations, the more we realize how much trouble we're in. I know that you and I are going to talk about how much more difficult it makes it for municipalities to actually sustain themselves when it comes to water and electricity that are coming out of abandoned buildings. That's an illegal connection. How does that affect municipality and then us?
Absolutely. And I think this is a issue which came to the spotlight but has been around for a while, and not only in the city of Johannesburg, as we've seen the disaster there, but we also noticed that in other centers in the country, the cities and the municipalities themselves. Firstly, we must look at the properties which are owned by the municipalities themselves, and there's also properties which are owned by national government or provincial government for that matter, and then there's private owners who have abandoned those buildings. So the sum total of those buildings, all of them connecting illegally to water as well as electricity, is a significant amount. And there's no measurement of services that are being used. So it's used until and leave the water and the taps running and so on and so forth. The infrastructure in those buildings as well has also decayed to some extent. So you may find that there's leaking pipes there, so there's water losses that are taking place there. The fact that there is winter where you need to warm up the buildings and to cook and all of those things. So the sum total of that is quite a huge amount which municipalities are losing. And we see that with the bills that they are struggling to pay or are in arrears when they have to pay ESCOM, and ESCOM is constantly having to threaten them about cutting them off.
You know what confuses me, Mr. Holeni? How a building owned by a municipality is left hijacked. I mean, aren't there people in the procurement process or in the process of billing people seeing that there's an issue here because Ntiyiso building is actually ours? Is there no one who would have been able to see that there's an issue there?
So I think, the practice with municipalities is that buildings as well as assets and all of those have been part and parcel of perhaps, a department of, whichever department. In this case, let's just say public works, to give a simple example for everyone to understand. So those buildings would be managed in that particular way. It's offices, it's residences, it's flats, it's a whole lot of different things. So then there's no strategic side, of managing those buildings. And at times you find that there are no systems to also capture and manage those buildings to see the buildings that they are being maintained, that the consumption that is taking place, the people who are there, the leases that are being there, and so on. So typically what should be happening is to make sure that you have some kind of a real estate section that looks after the real estate of the municipalities to be able to manage those. So if systems break down or there's an absence of systems, that is when you'll find those buildings not being accounted for. Bearing in mind that water and electricity, there's permitted and non-billing which municipalities would allow on their own properties. And if that number goes up, I think that is where the trigger should be to say that consumption is going up, we're collecting less, we're paying more for water, we're paying more for electricity. And those, I think, that the triggers that perhaps are not being paid attention to see that, then they must be brought under control, or what are the sources of consumption that are causing the consumption to increase.
Because whether it's public works or not, at the end of the day, it's a building that you're owning, and I assume that you're the one paying for whatever is being used in that particular building, and you're the one who is also billing for all buildings and all residents in the city. So that's where I get confused. But also, you mentioned public works or other arms of government that are responsible for buildings that are owned by a government. This then brings up the topic of different departments working in silo, not telling each other that I'm seeing something wrong here.
Absolutely. So I think, and that's the next point, you know, the fragmented nature of managing assets. I think that is the main thing that I was referring to saying, if you have at least a real estate, you know, a department or division or even a municipal-owned entity, yes, City of Joburg has, but if you look at the properties, there's a Department of Housing, they have properties.
Yes.
You'll find that, you know, there's a social housing company, they have their own assets. There's also the other departments like health, which sit, you know, with their own assets in the form of clinics and so on. So that fragmented nature of not being able to digitize all of those properties, to get a system that starts to manage the consumption, the occupation, and so on. That is what leads to all of these things. Because in this case, if we go deeper into some of the buildings that are being hijacked, you may find that it used to be used as an office block once upon a time, and everyone else has moved on, perhaps, you know, into a new building, which that one has been forgotten about. And there should not be instances like those where assets are not accounted for.
Yes. Let me squeeze in one more question because I am running out of time. You know, for me also, I know that you're obviously going to tell me that this is costing the city billions, right? Every year or annually, etc. But it all comes back to government.
Absolutely.
Because the issue is that as a municipality and as a government, you're not fulfilling your constitutional obligations that you promised in 1994. Vote for us and we'll give you housing. We'll give you land. It goes back to them every time.
Yeah, so I think the issue of the strategy of managing the inner city, I think that is one that we must really focus on. But also to look at the mix of social housing. There is social housing that is coming up in a beautiful way, but it's not coming up as quickly as it should as the buildings are being left behind. There's also other issues of not a lack of affordability with the private owners who are going to constantly negotiate with the municipality, but are not coming back, you know, with an arrangement that would be favorable to them. And they are left with an option of just abandoning it. But the issue here is that how you then create, you know, all of these assets and catalog them. You see the bills on a monthly basis, but the strategy then of the inner city is that there must be a new strategy that looks at how to rejuvenate the inner city, because that is where the core of the situation is. If one part of and the corporates are moving to the northern suburbs, we need to then look at, you know, how you then bring all of those assets, even those that have been abandoned, under a common ownership, but also to invite the private sector as well to be able to invest in some of those properties. And I know that with this, you know, there's discouragement with investing in the inner city, but that is the only option that can keep those buildings paying property rates and having not to lose or leak the billions that they are leaking currently.
Mr. Holeni, thank you very much for your time here on eNCA. It's a layered issue that we're seeing with this particular story. That was local government and revenue expert Miyelani Holeni.